Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel and today I am going to be doing a review, discussion, casual chit chat about a book that I just recently finished, my first big project book of the year, and that is Les Mis by Victor Hugo, which I started in January and just finished a few days ago. And I would like to talk a little bit about my reading experience, how I liked it, and some of my takeaways from it. So that's what I'm going to do today. I just read this translation by Christine Donaher from, I think it's like 2013. So it's relatively recent. It's, less than 15 years old, this translation. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this novel and my experience reading it for the first time, primarily. I have been pretty familiar with the story of Les Miserables for, quite a long time. I've been a big fan of the musical since I was a teenager, and I did attempt to read the novel when I was in high school, but I did not succeed at that time. I was not, I think, prepared for the, immensity, right? The 1,300 page immensity that is this novel when I was, 15 or so. But now I have successfully read it cover to cover. And I did have a very good time with it. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I would say that this is definitely not a book for everyone. I can understand why many people would bounce off it. I understand why I bounced off it when I was a teenager. There is a lot to it, and Victor Hugo definitely enjoys a tangent, of which there are several prominent ones in this novel. If you're unaware, the basic story of Les Mis is the story of a man, Jean Valjean, who is an ex-convict. So he's released from prison after 20 years for stealing a loaf of bread and then attempting to escape several times. And for that, he spends 20 years in prison. When he's released on parole, he immediately breaks his parole, but he becomes reformed. And so he is both a fugitive, because if he's ever found out, he will go back to prison for the rest of his life. But he is reformed and he's attempting to live his life as a godly man. And he goes through many trials and tribulations and meets many people and encounters many situations throughout his life. And so there's a huge cast of characters. It spans a few decades of French history in the early 19th century. Victor Hugo is very meticulous in his historicity, so he speaks he has a lot of research on, because he was writing this in the 1840s and 50s. It was published in the 1860s. This is primarily a story set in between like 1815 and 1832. So he's looking back after, a couple of decades of history. And so he has a lot to say about sort of recent French history, what was for him recent French history. And that is all very interwoven into the story. I really enjoyed my time with this book. Victor Hugo's narrative voice is very strong. I think that's one of the first things I want to say about it. He often interjects. He has a lot of commentary. This is very much a social problem novel. And so there is a point to the story that he's telling, right? He has a point or several points to make in telling the story. My understanding is that he was a socialist of a sort, a kind of socialist, and that he spent many years in exile from France because his beliefs, his political viewpoints were far too extreme. He was far too leftward leaning for his country at that time, and spent a number of years in exile because of it. And that really shines through in his writing in this novel. He's very pro democracy. He's very pro, he wants to get rid of poverty. He wants to get rid of ignorance. One of the earliest, it might even be like the dedication of the novel, and it's even printed on the cover of my copy, in fact, is, as long as there are ignorance and poverty on earth, books of this kind may serve some purpose. And that kind of is the thesis of Les Mis, right? Is he's telling a story about specific characters in order to shed light on broader social issues that he wants to have attention brought to. And I think, my biggest takeaway from this book is that it's telling that it is still so relevant today, more than 150 years after it was first published. The way that he talks about the very punitive justice system that existed in France at the time still rings with a lot of relevance to me in America in the 21st century, because America also has a very punitive justice system in the 21st century. And every politician who talks about, being quote unquote tough on crime has contributed to this sense of punitive justice, of retributive justice, that, once you're a criminal, you're always a criminal, and you're always sort of branded as a criminal, and you cannot escape it, and thus recidivism is very, very high. And, many people in prison, we have a, extremely high prison population in the United States, and many of the people in prison are there for nonviolent crimes, right, as Jean Valjean was. And they spend a lot of time in prison, and they end up coming back over and over again, because once you are branded as a convict, it is very hard to get away from that reputation, and it's very easy to fall back into criminality because you have so few other options. And that is my biggest takeaway from this book, frankly. So yeah, that is a big part of it for me. But another part of it is that the characters are very vivid, very well drawn. Obviously, Victor Hugo did not skimp on the word count here, and much of that is discussing characters and getting into their heads in a really detailed kind of way. The book opens not with Jean Valjean, but with a bishop. The bishop who eventually is the one who sort of converts Jean Valjean, who reforms him. And we spend a lot of time with this bishop. We spend a lot of time knowing exactly what kind of life he led and exactly what kind of person he was, so that when he does perform this act of beautiful charity, we completely understand the full context of it, and why he does it, and what kind of person he is, and we can fully contextualize it in his life as a bishop, and we fully understand it. So yeah, we really get into the characters' heads in a very detailed way, which I loved. And Hugo is really good, I think, at generally not passing judgment on most of these characters. A character like Fantine, for instance, who eventually, winds up in as a prostitute. He's very sympathetic to her, and we see the gradual steps, and we follow along with her as she is, again, like, her options get narrower and narrower and narrower over time, and it all makes perfect sense, horribly perfect sense, tragically perfect sense, that she ends up in the situation that she ends up in. And it does a very good job, at least in my case, of eliciting my sympathy and my understanding and my empathy. And even characters like Javert, who is not a very likable person, right? He's a very rigid person. He's a very black and white kind of person. He believes that, you know, the word of the law is sacrosanct. He respects authority to an egregious degree in some cases. We understand everything that he does and why he does it. Even a character like Thénardier, who is a very bad character. And another thing that I appreciate about Victor Hugo in this novel is the way in which he shades all of the characters and doesn't shy away from the fact that some of these characters are bad people and do bad things and will continue to do bad things, and that they will not stop doing bad things. And even, you know, receiving a reward or receiving a charitable contribution or anything like that is not going to stop them from being bad. There are people who are like that in the world, and he doesn't shy away from that either. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a little bit of nuance and understanding in sort of the law codes and in our justice system, and you know, being able to take people on a case-by-case basis and try to understand them rather than simply say, well, if you do this, then you go to prison for this number of years or whatever. So I really liked that about it as well. Yeah, it's very, he's also very good at writing suspense in some ways. There are definitely a number of moments, especially in the back half of the book, that I found very suspenseful, and he's quite good at, he likes to do a thing where he gives you a kind of cliffhanger, and then he immediately goes into one of his tangents about something, you know? So he'll, you know, he'll say, oh, you know, it'll be like, oh, what's going to happen with Jean Valjean next? Is he going to, you know, escape again and get through this situation? And then you turn the page and he's starting a new chapter and he's going to talk about convents for 15 pages. And we're not going to even get back to Jean Valjean for a little bit here, which can be frustrating, but also, like, in some ways it's very effective. It's a very effective form of writing and suspense building. So it's also a fun story often. I've read more, you know, enjoyable, excitable novels, right? Like The Count of Monte Cristo, I think, is kind of my example of like a big novel that doesn't read to me like a big novel. It's just very fun and the plot sort of pushes forward all the time. Les Mis is not like that. It definitely is not like that. But it does have its moments. It does have its moments. Particularly around the revolution and the June 1832 revolution, and the barricades. And, you know, he does a good job of, again, sort of keeping you in suspense, and then he goes off on a tangent about like the history of barricades and how this event in 1832 would be affecting the revolution of 1848, and and then he goes back to Enjolras and the others on the barricade, which is very, again, it can be frustrating, but it's also like kind of funny sometimes. So yeah, I really enjoyed my time with Les Mis. I think it was a great book. I thought, you know, again, as a project book, I'm glad I did it. I've been meaning to sort of tackle it again. And I took the opportunity to do so here at the beginning of this year. And for me, I think that made for a very good start to my reading year, to have read such, you know, such a sort of notoriously long, but also well-regarded 19th century novel, to have enjoyed it as much as I did. That made for a very good start to my reading year. And again, it just feels very continually relevant, which I think is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? I wish it wasn't as relevant as it still is, because the world is unfortunately still pretty messed up in a lot of ways, and Victor Hugo saw how messed up it was in the 19th century. And there's a great passage towards the end of the book where he talks about how he thinks by the 20th century, so much of this stuff will be fixed and the world will be so much better. And unfortunately, he was absolutely wrong about that, which is just too bad. But at least we do have this great work of art that we can still read and appreciate in the 21st century, no matter how bad the world otherwise is. At least we have this, right? At least we have Les Mis in this great translation, and I'm glad that I read it. So that is my little talk about Les Mis and my reading experience of it. I hope that you enjoyed. If you have anything else to say about Les Mis, feel free to leave it in the comments. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.